Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about prime rib. These things can be pretty intimidating. First, they're pretty expensive as you can see here. Second, they're kind of a big deal.
Sorry, Napoleon, we're just running a little bit late for some prime rib.
I mean, if Kip is taking Wolflandau for prime rib, it's kind of a big deal. But trust me when I say this, these things are a lot easier to prepare than what you might think. And you have a pretty big margin for error too. For the first step, all you need is the meat, salt, and pepper. So what do you say we get going with this thing?
Okay, after removing it from the packaging, we're going to start by scoring the top of the roast. This is done by cutting a crosshatch pattern with your knife, which will help the fat render into the meat much easier during cooking, and it will also help some of the salt reach the interior portion of the roast as well. Once you are finished with that, flip the roast over, and just as you would when preparing a rack of ribs for barbecuing, remove the membrane that is attached to the bottom of the rib cage. And while the rib roast I purchased came packaged with part of the rib section separated, I still need to separate it the rest of the way. Doing this will not only make carving much easier later on, it will also allow for the salt to reach the interior of the meat much easier. And speaking of salt, we can now season our roast. You'll notice that I am using a considerable amount of salt here. One of the biggest mistakes that novice cooks make is not seasoning their food enough. Be very liberal when applying the salt here. It is a larger cut of meat and requires a larger amount of salt. Now we are ready to put the two sections back together. Tying a few strands of butcher's twine around the roast should sufficiently secure it back together. It is now ready to go uncovered into the refrigerator.
So I'm going to be leaving this in the refrigerator for a period of 3 days. And this brings up the question on whether this is aging or not. The answer to that? Sort of. It's important to remember that when aging, individual cuts are not aged. Rather, entire carcasses, primals, and subprimals are aged. There are two main things occurring in dry aging. One, moisture loss resulting from an air drying effect. Two, muscle enzyme activity changing the structure and composition of the meat itself. You are getting small amounts of both, but these things take time. This process takes quite a bit longer than the 3 days I'm giving it. It's important to remember that when this is done on an industrial level or at your favorite steakhouse, the temperature, airflow, and humidity are heavily controlled to allow this to happen and prevent spoilage. So trying this in your home refrigerator doesn't always work. Well, hopefully things make a little bit more sense than they did before. Anyway, let's get back to the roast.
Okay, getting back to it, and when taking a look at the roast, we can see it looks noticeably different due to the moisture evaporation on the surface. This is a good thing because without the moisture present, the roast will brown up much easier in the oven. But before placing it into the oven, I'm going to coat the surface with a small amount of olive oil. This will help evenly distribute heat around the entire surface and promote more even browning. It is now ready to go into a 250-degree oven for approximately 3 hours.
While this is in the oven, let's go over the idea of the time to weight to temperature ratios and things like that. You might have come across some recipes that say something like, cook this at 20 minutes per pound or something like that. This is a very unreliable way of cooking meats. The most obvious way to put this is to imagine one piece of meat shaped like a slab and the other one shaped like a sphere. Obviously, those would not have the same ratios. And you might be thinking to yourself, a rib roast is a rib roast. That's what we're making here, right? Well, these have quite a bit of variation in their shape as well, as do a lot of other meats of the same kind. So don't be afraid to pull it out of the oven from time to time to check the temperature. After all, you spent quite a bit of money on this thing, so you want to make sure it turns out right. Anyway, let's get back to it.
Okay, now the roast has been in the oven for about 2 hours, so I'm going to go ahead and get a temperature reading to see where it's at. And while I know the roast isn't going to be all the way done, it's a good idea to check this a few times during the cooking process. Right now the internal temperature is around 105, so this needs to go back into the oven until the internal temperature reads around 125. That should take about 45 minutes to an hour. And while that's in the oven, let's go ahead and make a quick au jus sauce. Start by combining 1 ounce onion with 1/2 ounce each celery and carrot in a small sauce pot over medium to high heat. Cook this mixture until it becomes lightly browned around the edges. Then we're going to add a small amount of tomato paste to the pan. And as a side note, the tube form of tomato paste is better than the canned form. Cook this until the paste takes on a light rusty color. Cooking aromatics in this way and developing a rich brown color is known as pinçage in French cooking. Once all of the ingredients have taken on a little bit of color, we can go ahead and add 2 cups of water to the pot. Now, using whatever brand of beef base you prefer, I'm using More Than Gourmet. Follow your package's instructions and use the recommended amount to produce 2 cups of beef stock. To the pot, I am also adding a few sprigs of thyme, a bay leaf, a pinch of salt, and about 4 or 5 peppercorns for some added flavor. Bring everything up to a simmer to dissolve the base, and after about 5 minutes of simmering, we can go ahead and strain the sauce out. After straining, go ahead and make any final seasoning adjustments that are needed. I should mention this sauce can be made a day or 2 in advance, and also because it comes together so quickly, it can be made at the last minute too. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and make a quick horseradish cream sauce. To make this, combine 1/2 cup or 4 ounces of sour cream with 1/4 cup of heavy cream, 1 to 2 tablespoons of horseradish depending on your taste, 3 grams of garlic, 6 grams of shallot, the zest of 1/2 lemon, a pinch of salt, and some thinly sliced chives. Stir the mixture together and you're set. This can also be made a day or 2 in advance or at the last minute. Okay, getting back to the roast, it's been in the oven for about 3 hours and I'm shooting for an internal temperature of around 125. Mine is registering around 127, which is perfect. Now all we have left to do is to brown the top of the roast under the broiler. To do this, set your oven's broiler setting to high and cut the strands of twine away from the roast. I've prepared a garlic and herb butter to spread across the surface, and I will include the recipe for this in the description of the video. It's now ready to go under the broiler, and this step will only take about 2 or 3 minutes. And after completing this, the roast needs to rest for 30 minutes prior to cutting into it. Okay, now that the resting time is complete, go ahead and separate the 2 sections again, and let's carve into it and see what it looks like. And would you look at that, I'd say we have a pretty good looking medium rare there. And before checking out, I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, and I hope you enjoy the recipe. And thanks for tuning in.